Hello and welcome to the Everything is Black and White podcast. I'm joined by a football expert, Mark Douglas. It is the day after Newcastle drew 1-1 with Aston Villa up at St James's Park. We want your questions about that game, about Newcastle, Steve Bruce. Anything you want to ask Mark, just pop it in the comments and we'll get through the best of them. Mark, what did you make of last night's game?
Another really tough watch, actually. I thought they were lucky to get away with the draw in the end, given the way that they conceded. But the biggest frustration for me was the second time in less than a week, a really winnable game against opposition not playing particularly well. And I didn't think Newcastle was set up right at the start. I know Steve Bruce has talked about this split strikers thing that they're trying, and he obviously believes that that's the way to go, and he's not going to divert from that. But I think sometimes you have to look at what you've got and maybe change depending on what you have got. And they haven't got the three players that they're missing at the moment. There's St Maximin, Almiron, and Callum Wilson. The three players who've come in are very different players. I thought Jolinton did quite well for about half an hour, 40 minutes, but again, he's just not the same kind of player as a Callum Wilson or as a St Maximin, as an Almiron. So, I thought I thought he got the system wrong. But I suppose credit to them for fighting on at the end, but how much are they going to regret that when they've got the run of games that they're coming up? It just feels like at the moment they're doing just enough for there to be no big questions in the eyes of the board anyway about the manager, but maybe not enough at the moment to get themselves away from the relegation zone. So massively frustrating. It could have been worse. So I suppose from that perspective, I'm feeling a little bit better today than I was kind of at 91 minutes, but still feels like a massive opportunity missed.
You mentioned the run of games they've got: Spurs, Burnley, West Ham, Liverpool, Arsenal, Man City and Leicester to come. I mean, they're just some of the games. I mean, that's not a good run in, and yes, you've got to play everyone at some point. But the past few weeks, especially the last three games, these are the games that Newcastle really should have been targeting, and they've come away with only 3 points as opposed to 6 or 9.
Yeah, and what was frustrating, I think, why there was the anger last week after West Brom was the attitude of, well, we just couldn't get beaten today. That was the most important thing. We couldn't afford to lose. And then you saw Fulham going to, admittedly, a bit of a free hit against Liverpool, but they've played the same way in a lot of their sort of 6-pointers, 6-pointers. You saw them come to St James's Park and dominate the game up here as well. And you just wonder whether that attitude is going to work out in the end. I mean, Steve Bruce, he's just so downbeat in the post-match and even the pre-match as well, talking about, it's an accumulation of points. It's like, yes, but if you're talking about picking up a point here and there, that's fine. But at some point, they're going to have to win games. And I've done our relegation predictor this afternoon. I've only got them winning one game, but then I looked at, and now I've got them staying up and with a few draws. But then I looked at what I'd done for Brighton, and I was very pessimistic about Brighton. I think I only had them winning under the 5 points all season. And that was with a point next week, by the way, against Newcastle. So that's the game now, isn't it? That's a huge game. And I think as our chief sports writer, Lee Ryder, pointed out to me earlier, Fulham are actually playing on Friday against Leeds as well. So I think because the games are all structured in a different way, it's going to be an interesting one. Newcastle had a massive chance last night to sort of put a bit of distance between themselves and bottom three by winning that game, putting a bit of pressure on. I just don't think they were set up right, and I think that's the frustration for me. That's the big frustration for me, that they just at the moment seem, Steve Bruce is sort of thinking, right, we'll go back to safety first, don't concede, don't lose games, and we'll pick up the points that we need to get to kind of 37, 38 points towards the end of the season. But I'm not seeing it. I'm hoping that when they, let's be honest, they've regressed massively in the last two games because they haven't got Almiron, they haven't got ASM, they haven't got Wilson, and that's big. I think they would have won one of these two games with those three players involved. Almiron, running at that Villa defence, I think he would have, it would have made a difference. Some Maximin there is the difference maker. Wilson, scoring the goals, it would have made a difference, no doubt about it. In my opinion, I think they would have been much more of a threat. But with what they have got, I don't think they did enough in the last two games. And that was shown by the fact that at the end, when they were going for it, Villa did look vulnerable. When Jacob Murphy came on, Villa looked vulnerable. They could have got something from that game. They could have got 3 points from the match. So, it's a really weird situation at the moment because it just doesn't feel like, we were talking last night. I thought 1-0 down. In my head, I'm thinking, doing the Saturday shift, this could be the day that they decide to make the change. But then I think in the kind of cold light of day, I don't think even that would have persuaded them to make the change. And that's the weird situation. I don't think he's under any pressure unless it gets really, really grim. And even then, it would probably be get rid of him. Graham Jones comes in. So they're in such a strange position because, the fans are fed up. The players look as if they're just trying to get to the end of the season and accumulate points, as Steve Bruce would say. And we're just in a weird situation. It doesn't feel, I know people keep saying it's like 2016 or it's like 2008. It just doesn't feel like that to me, because you forget 2016, Newcastle were up against it. They were down there trying to get their heads above water. In 2008, it was the same situation. They hadn't won enough games trying to get their head above water. Newcastle had such a sort of, fairly decent start to the season that they're actually in a good position going into Christmas. They didn't need to pick up massive wins, but they certainly couldn't afford to go through a run of 2 wins in 19. I mean, the fact that they're still out of the bottom 3, despite the fact that they've had that run, shows you at the start of the season they would have been okay. Newcastle decided not to act. They're not going to act now, I don't think, unless it gets really, really grim. So we're kind of sat here thinking, can they get those points? And I think we're just all going through and picking out games where they can go and get them. But the way they've played in the last 3 games, I don't think I'm confident about next weekend. I think that will be a draw at best. Brighton will go for them as well. And then we are, getting into international break with a really tough run of fixtures. Burnley away is the one that you would target and say they win that one. But Burnley away, they've not had a great record there. It's been very mixed. I know they won under Benitez, but it's been pretty mixed record there, really, in the last few years. And Burnley know how to dog out wins. Do Newcastle. I mean, that's the one thing you would say yesterday that yes, they probably do, because the Lascelles got the header, and that's why I'm saying it feels different from 2018 and 2016 and 2008, because you didn't have a dressing room fighting like the dressing room are fighting this time. It's just whether the tactics and whether the personnel are good enough to get them out of it.
I'd put the table Mark was talking about there, and he's got Sheffield United, West Brom, Brighton going down, Newcastle 17th on 36 points. So fingers crossed the table doesn't look too dissimilar to that, and Newcastle do manage to survive. You mentioned there, had they lost last night, and maybe there would have been questions about Cyprus's future, but then again, would they have been the hierarchy don't seem to want to act? Do you think they've been burned, or Mike Ashley's had his fingers burned when you look back at that relegation 2008 and 9, and then the Rafa Benitez relegation? The fact that he did change it and it didn't work. Do you think he's had his fingers burned by that? Even though the argument, and it's a valid one, is that he acted too slow in both the cases, both the previous relegations.
Well, if he is, and I think you're right. I think Newcastle's attitude to this is that they want to try and get to the end of the season, stay in the Premier League, and sort of reassess. I mean, obviously Ashley's trying to get this takeover over the line, which is his big thing. So he won't want to spend the amount of money that it's going to cost to bring in another manager. And I think probably they haven't done much due diligence. I wouldn't have thought they've probably done any due diligence on who would come in as a manager instead of Steve Bruce. But is there this massive list of candidates out there that they think are going to be better than what they've got? Well, I would argue that a new manager would be a fresh voice and those kind of things as well. But they would argue that no, that's not necessarily the case. We haven't got a world-class manager like Rafa Benitez waiting in the wings. And when we did do it in 2008, 2016, it made a difference. 2016, they were too late. They left it far too late. Rafa Benitez probably could have come in a bit earlier. I mean, it hadn't been out of the job at Real Madrid for too long, but if he had have come in a little bit earlier than that, I think they would have beaten the drop that season. 2008, they were just all over the place. They actually weren't that far away from staying up in 2008 as well. Alan Shearer will probably admit himself that he made mistakes when he came in. He tried to change things too quickly, but even then, they got the win against Middlesbrough. I think they only then needed to see out a game against Fulham, was it? I can't remember, Fulham or Stoke, I can't remember. It's burned in my memory the final day of the season, but there was definitely a point before then. And against Villa on the final day of the season, when neither team really looked that bothered, they only need to get a point then and they would have stayed up, and they didn't. So they could have, it's a false argument really. I think probably the biggest thing in Mike Ashley's head is the money that it would cost to change manager right now. Is he going to get the benefit from bringing somebody in? I mean, Steve Bruce was mortally offended by Lee Ryder mentioning Eddie Howe early in the season. But I suppose Eddie Howe, they would say, well, he took Bournemouth down last season, so is he the right man to bring them in? I don't know. To me, at the moment, it just feels as if they've made their decision. I mean, I got kind of. I said last week they were sticking their fingers in their ears and was assured by Newcastle United that that's not the case. They do know that they're in trouble, and they are trying to do things behind the scenes to change it. But the biggest thing they could have done is change manager earlier when it was clear that things were going in the wrong direction. I will give credit to Bruce and to the coaching staff that they definitely have looked better since Graham Jones came in. They haven't in the last 2 games, but I wonder whether that's just because of the players that they're missing in terms of injuries. My big hope is that they go back in when those players come back in. They then start to play a little bit better. They start to play like they did in the previous games, and we'll be okay. But at the moment, I feel Fulham are on the rise, and it's a question of whether Brighton can beat Southampton tomorrow. And if they can, that's a massive game changer, because I don't expect Fulham to pick up anything against Man City tonight. Although, obviously they got that unexpected win against Liverpool, which, has changed the picture again. It's really Brighton, I think, they're the ones this weekend that I'm most worried about, because Southampton is a winnable game for them, and they've been unlucky, Brighton. Their expected goals is much higher than where they are in the league, and that's probably Newcastle's is probably about where they are. So Brighton at the moment are worrying me a little bit, although they're on a terrible run of form as well.
Yeah, Brighton should be 5th in the league if you believe all that expected goals nonsense. 5th,
yeah,
45 points. I spoke to their reports to our colleague down in Sussex the other day, and he was explaining about how they've maybe underachieved in terms of what the stats tell them. Question there from Paul James Mark. Do you think it's now too late to change manager? He feels that the time has passed.
Sorry, I just interrupted you there before we finished. Not that the happens sometimes when we're watching Newcastle, doesn't it? I think that it's probably. Is it too late? I mean, this was the run of games. Yeah, I can see that, because this was the run of games where you felt you could have got a new manager bounce. Wolves, West Brom, Villa, and then Brighton was the 4 games where, if they'd have made the change or brought new players in, they could have potentially, I think made a big difference there. It does feel a little bit like that to me. Although I think if they'd have lost yesterday, there would have been some big questions. And I think what would likely happen if they get to the point where they do start to worry about Steve Bruce and they start making a change would be Graham Jones. I think he would come in and take interim charge, because he has done. He's made a decent impression down the training ground already, and he would probably be seen as the next man capable, because he has tried to get them playing a different way. So I do think possibly it is too late. I think that anybody coming in now, with sort of 9-10 games to go, 10 games, isn't it, for Newcastle now and Fulham, they would look at and say, well, if I don't keep you up, what's my prospects after that? Because an Eddie Howe isn't going to want to come in for 10 games. A Sam Allardyce you might get to come in for 10 games, or somebody else. But I don't think, a manager who's got a decent reputation is going to want to come in for 10 games and not want to know what the plans were for after the season, which I think is part of the reason why Newcastle haven't made the change, because they haven't got the answers to those questions. Would Eddie Howe want to come in? I mean, I think it was Paul Merson mentioned Steven Gerrard last week, wasn't it? And the tweet went sort of viral on our Twitter feed. People saying, why would Steven Gerrard want to come in and stuff? And I think that's exactly true. He's not going to want to come in. He's not going to want to leave Rangers in the situation they are in to come into Newcastle. So you're not going to make a good decision. I don't think a good strategic decision. The time for that was earlier. I think there was the flag, wasn't there? The war flags put out that act late, seal your fate. I think they probably have acted late, or they haven't acted. And if they did act now, it probably would be too late. So I think probably they have left it too late. Doesn't mean that it might not be the right thing to do, but I think they probably have left it too late. And what we can hope is that when the players, the thing that I'm hoping is when the players come back, things will change.
Just on that, the fact that Steve Bruce yesterday said about the players returning, so that's Almiron, St. Maximin and Wilson, and he said it should give us something to focus on. Now, to me, that didn't sit too well, because you can interpret that many ways, but the way I saw it is he kind of saying, well, we've kind of just a limp over the line to them returning. but there's still points to play for, and they might not even be back that first game after the international break. And you've still got Brighton. You've had the previous 3 games. I mean, where you speak to people who cover Fulham, and there is this belief that they go out and they win games. That's their aim, and I struggle to see that with Newcastle. They don't seem confident in themselves.
Yeah, Steve Bruce's press conferences are, I don't know whether it's just his natural sort of way that he is. I've kind of covered Sunderland when he was the manager there, and obviously he's been here now for a couple of years as well. And I'm not sure. I've just started to notice it the last few weeks. I think possibly because these are must-win games. The way that he talks about the team and the way it's all hopefully, we'll have to see what happens. Those kind of things, and language matters. We know language matters. I'd like to see some of the passion that he puts into, with the greatest respect, attacking the media and attacking his critics. I talk about the games like that. He's as soon as it talks about people having a go at him, or people having a go at the team, or people having a go at Newcastle, or the local media, it's very much like, this is a disgrace. You can see the passion in his in his voice and in his face. He's affronted by that criticism of him. But then he talks about the man. It's hopefully we'll win the game. And I'm sure behind the closed doors there is the passion and there's those kind of things. Maybe he just needs to think about the message that he's projecting. I know Rafa wasn't the biggest tub thumper in the world. He wasn't, but there was that kind of quiet surety to Rafa. We'll do what we need to do, and we'll stay up. I'm sure we will. But this is a bit more like the McLaren sort of way of choosing your words carefully, because if you say it's a must win and you lose, are people going to attack me? I think there's a bit of that with Steve Bruce. He feels like he's a little bit hunted, if you will, is the right word. And I think he tones down what he says, because he feels like he doesn't want to set himself up for those headlines of must-win game has been lost. But yeah, I think it does project. I mean, Scott Parker, it was like the other week when, I saw a little bit of that fire in Steve Bruce when Scott Parker said, we're hunting down, something like, I don't think he even said we're hunting down Newcastle, but it was like, we know that we're going for them, or something. It was like that. It wasn't, definitely wasn't a diss. And he kind of snapped back and said, well, we'll see where they are at the end of the season. And I thought, no, you need, is that the right message? I'm not sure. So yeah, I do wonder, and I wonder whether that sometimes comes across in the formation. There's no doubt from my mind last week where, what has been a successful tactic for Steve Bruce in his season and a half until this really bad run was, whenever things weren't going well, is he went back to safety first. We'll dog out as the points where we can get them, and it worked. They bounced back in style, and they kind of did that against Everton, and then obviously lost to Palace, which I think, by the way, is going to be if they go down, that's the day they went down. Is Palace losing that game when they played really well? That was just unbelievable. So wasteful for Newcastle to lose that game. But then they play against Southampton. It felt like he's getting the reaction he needs out of them. The fact that Fulham came roaring back with the kind of Scott Parker's attitude of, we are going to stay up. I'm confident we're going to do everything we can to stay up. And Fulham, by the way, as a club, went into January and did the business that they needed to do. They got some good players in January. Newcastle got Joe Willock. And to be fair to Steve Bruce, he said to the board, and could do with more players here. You don't know what's going to happen. And they blocked it. They said, there's no money. We haven't got the money to do it. So you have to go with what you've got. We've got enough here. We've got strikers that we need to stay up. They haven't scored since Wilson's been. They've scored 1 goal. Jamal Lascelles. No other strikers have scored since Wilson was injured. That's the worry, isn't it? That's the worry that you've got. Is Newcastle, I think, were, they would argue not, but I think they've been guilty of complacency. They lost that game to Sheffield United. That was the moment, I think, that things started to go really, really wrong, because the performance was just dreadful. At that point, they should have realised we could be in a dogfight here, but they looked at the table, I think, and they saw it was 9 points or something, with 7 points, 8 points, whatever it was. I think it got to 11 points at one point, didn't it? And they just thought, we're not going to go down. We're not going to get dragged into it. We've got enough points, the accumulation of points they talk about. And I think now they're in a dogfight. January's passed. They haven't got the chance. They can't change manager anymore. They've lost key players. And I think they found themselves in a dogfight that they didn't expect. And the one positive that I've got is that the players are clearly still battling. You saw how they did in the last few minutes. They could have got, their heads could have gone down. They didn't. They kept battling. And that gives me a bit of hope. And I don't think he's lost the dressing room. That was the kind of talk, wasn't it, the other week? He's lost the dressing room. The dressing room was split. But the way that they're playing suggests that, I think it's a complex thing to say that they've lost the dressing room, because you kind of lose bits of the dressing room probably. And there are probably players in there who are really annoyed with him. But he's not lost the dressing room because they're still fighting for him. And now those are the kind of things that you just hope are going well. But it's ridiculous. We're in this situation. And I'd be lying if I sat here and said I was confident they were going to stay up. I'm hopeful, and I still think they've got the edge. But we'll see where they are by Monday, because it could be a different story by then.
It certainly could have. Fulham beat City, and then Brighton beat Southampton. You mentioned there the fight that was on show last night. We heard Kieran Clark kind of screaming as the goal went in, and Lascelles looked like he just won a cup final. And of course, the man who assisted Lascelles, who put the ball in the box, was Murphy. And Steve Presley here says, I thought Murphy was excellent coming on. I think he should start the next game. But I'm thinking the formation needs to change to suit Murphy, and he would also bring Cowell in so to suit the big man up top as well. What do you think of that, Mark?
Yeah, well, I would like to see that, but it's not going to happen, is it? Because the way that Steve Bruce is talking, he's going to stick with this split strikers situation that he talked about. I mean, I've not really heard of that formation so much before. It's not one that I'd heard of too much, but it looks to me like a kind of 4-3-3 with a sort of false. I mean, who knows? It looks like a false 9 almost, because he's not playing quite as a traditional number 9. But Callum Wilson was playing as. But I think Murphy's got to come in. I think he's got to come in. He looked lively. I think he's been unlucky the last few weeks. I'd like to see Matty Longstaff involved again as well. The energy there. John Joe Shelby's, I don't think he's getting as involved. I know that Steve Bruce will keep playing him because he feels like he's got the experience, and he's done it before. But I just worry. I do worry that they're a bit too pedestrian in there at times, and that to me is what worries me. That's what worries me, is that they just he sticks with what he knows for Brighton, and maybe go there and get another point. But are they doing it at the expense of maybe going with a slightly more exciting lineup, a Longstaff in there, Jacob Murphy, somebody like that, and maybe even Andy Carroll. I think when he came on, he did, he showed a little bit more than we'd seen from Newcastle before. Then if you get Jacob Murphy in there, like you said, Andy Carroll, maybe attacking crosses, it's something different, isn't it? It gives teams something to worry about. But he's only had 3 or 4 minutes in the last 2 games, so I think it's pretty clear that he's not going to make that change. I think it'll be whether Gale plays or whether Hendrick plays next week. And he leaves himself open to criticism then, doesn't he? Because if they don't win, it'll be the same thing that we're talking about now. Will be the same argument on Sunday morning next week as well.
I mean, with that system, okay, so he says we're going to continue, using it. That's what he replied to when Lee Ryder asked him last night. I think for many, though, it's not even a case of changing the system. It's just playing Dwight Gale in the centre and Ryan Fraser out on the wing. Because, and I wrote a piece that'll be going on the website later, because if you look at the stats and you look back at the game last night, they were moving instinctively into those positions. Mm-hmm. So we can kind of all see it, and you go on social media, I think we've all said, journalists as well, Dwight Gale is just ineffective when he's played out in a wide position, which, okay, suits Callum Wilson because that's his style of play. It doesn't suit Dwight Gale at all. So if you don't want to change the system, okay, don't, but at least put Gale into the centre and give him a chance of being a poacher, getting the ball, and give him a chance of actually firing on goal.
Where's he scored all his goals? What's the position where he scored all his goals in the Championship and scored goals last season for Newcastle? It's through the middle. That's where he plays. This is going to be the big question now for Newcastle in the next few games, is whether this system that he sort of thinks plays the way that he wants to play. The gloves are off, all that kind of stuff. It's whether this is going to get the points that you need, because, like you said, it's like we're kind of sitting here debating all these things. I think fans have got this feeling as well on social media. We're sitting debating, should they play, should they do, but we know what they're going to do. We know what the club are going to do. It's almost like the Bruce out thing has lost a little bit of its momentum, because fans know it's not realistic at the moment. It's not going to happen, because the club, who they just have lost all faith in, are not going to make that change. And it's like the same with this formation thing. We know the 4-3-3 is going to be, maybe be tinkering around the edges, but he's not going to make the big change to change tactically. And my worry with that is that opposition managers know it as well, and they know how to set up against Newcastle. When you haven't got Almiron, when you haven't got St Maximin, they're a bit more predictable. They're a bit more pedestrian, and they were very much pedestrian for the first 60 minutes last night, which is why I think if you're going to do nothing else, just bring Murphy in, because he's something different and he can play in the formation that you've got. That you've got. I mean, he's not always the most consistent, and I think that's why he's not in the team more often. But he's got a bit of something about him as well. It's why I tweeted about Elliot Anderson last night. Look, I don't see Elliot Anderson every day in training, so I don't know. Maybe he's not. Maybe there are other players ahead of him in training. But my point about Elliot Anderson, the point about Matty Longstaff is it's like it adds something different that opposition managers don't know about. I think if I was an opposition manager, I'd quite happily played against Newcastle the first half, because they weren't going to score goals. They weren't going to threaten you. They were quite difficult to break open, fair enough. But I don't think Graham Potter will be looking at the first half of last week and yesterday, and thinking, well, there's anything to worry about there. And that's the big concern, I think, for me looking into these games. Where are where are they going to surprise teams? They do when they've got Almiron, they do when they've got some maximum. Teams look like they struggle to play against them when those two are in full flow. But I don't think it's difficult to play against the Newcastle that we saw last night.
But even with those three players in the likes of Wilson, Almiron, and St Maximin, they still only picked up 2 wins in that time. Do you know what I mean? So they beat Everton, they beat Southampton, but they still haven't picked up the wins. So I think some fans look at it and say, well, yeah, okay, we're missing them, but it's not like everything was rosy and the flowers were coming up, when they were playing, when they were fit.
No, but but I think it's fair to say, and I understand that, and when he talks about not having some Maximin in particular, I kind of feel a little bit like, you were going to drop him, and Almiron couldn't always get in the team. Wilson, fair enough, he's always been in there. But having said that, when they played the way that they're playing at the moment, and you had those 3 involved, as much as, even if you're the biggest critic of Steve Bruce, you have to concede they were playing better and they had much more threat in that period of time. They definitely did. From about the second half of Leeds until the West Brom game, it was a different Newcastle, and they didn't. They lost some games there. They lost to Palace, but they lost to Manchester United, obviously. But even in the Manchester United game, I mean, Chelsea, they were awful in that game. I wouldn't really include that one in there. But Manchester United, the first 45 minutes, they went ahead, should have been 2-1 ahead. They did play well in that game. And they played well against Southampton, then, should have beaten, should have won more games, I think, should have picked up more points than they did in that game. So, I know what you mean. Yeah, he hasn't done enough with, and the reason why I kind of am, I'm feel the way I do about the manager is because they didn't do enough when they did have those players involved. And they were far too conservative in so many of those games, and they're now paying for that, because they need to get points, and they need to get players. They need to get points and on the board without their best players now, and that's the biggest worry for me is that they now find themselves in a situation they shouldn't be in. So yeah, I know what you mean, but you can't say that they weren't in a better shape in the last 3 games than they have.
Got someone here, Mark Gordon, saying you sound like you do a good job in the dugout. Fancy the job.
I don't know about that, mate. The Championship Manager game is last Championship Manager game didn't go as well as I hope so. Maybe not.
Just going back to those comments about him kind of saying we've got to focus on getting to a stage and then welcoming back those 3 players. What message does that send out to the players who have come in and replaced them? Because, I mean, we've got Paul here who says, if I was a player coming in to replace any of those 3, I'd be working my backside off to maintain my place. And he only saw it from Murphy last night. And I can see that. I don't think anyone's coming in and really done enough. But at the same time, if you're hearing that and you're thinking, well, even if I do enough, am I just going to get booted out when all 3 of them are fit? What do you make of that?
I think it's a difficult one because, nobody. You've got to say. I understand. The that you can make a point. You can make a point that, you know, why aren't you building up your players a little bit more? But I don't think there'll be anybody in that dressing room, in all seriousness, who doesn't know that those three players are their three best players, pretty much outfield players anyway. And so I think there won't be a sort of idea of, oh, well, why isn't he talking about me? There might be one or two who feel like, well, why aren't you giving me a chance? And I think Andy Carroll certainly feels like that. I think Matt Ritchie probably feels like that. I think Sean Longstaff would be wondering why they can't get in the team, those kind of things. But in terms of him, you know, I think he's just, you know, with that one, I would kind of say, you know, he's telling the truth and he's being honest that those three players are absolutely key. What I think is unfair sometimes is you know, you see some players getting chance upon chance upon chance to kind of keep going. You know, John Joe Shelby would be one. Jeff Hendrick until recently was getting a lot of games, despite the fact I didn't think he was playing that well. But I think there were others who seem to be in and out of the team. I mean, Sean Longstaff's got a good run, but he's not been, you know, he's not had a chance to do anything recently. Matty Longstaff, I mean, I'm totally and utterly bewildered by what's gone on there, because I think he did well in the games that he played in, but he's been, in my opinion, you know, unfairly overlooked in the last few weeks as well. And then I've mentioned about Elliot Anderson, who could possibly make a difference as well. But I don't think, you know, he's probably telling any state secrets to say that those three players, as soon as they're fit, will be in the team. I was shocked that he was going to drop Alan Saint-Maximin before the Crystal Palace game, and there was a lot of like feeding in, wasn't there? Like, oh, he's not lifting a finger in training. It's like, come on, you know, he's your best player, he's your biggest creative asset, he's the only player who makes a difference. Play him, nurture him, look after him. You've done that for the first season that you were here, so don't be ridiculous, you know, to keep playing him. And same with Almiron. Why Almiron wasn't playing the position that he's played the last 5 to 10 games? That's been the big difference. I talked about the game since Leeds United second half. That's Almiron being shifted into a position that suits him, and suddenly he looks like a great player, and Newcastle look like they've got so much more about them. So it's not difficult, is it? It's not difficult. It doesn't feel like that difficult to me that you play your best players in the positions that they're best in, and you know you're going to look more dangerous than you do when you mess around.
No, indeed. And the final question mark, we'll finish on that dreaded subject, which is takeover. We had last week Newcastle lost out in the High Court to have the chairman of the arbitration panel removed. I guess that coming out and being public kind of sent a message to the consortium, especially the Public Investment Fund, that, you know, for Mike Ashley, he's determined to sell this club, and he's determined to sell it to one group and one group only. Yeah. Which actually has caused a bit of, you know, there've been a few people sort of ask about alternative bidders, and you know, I think probably a few people who want to buy the club, or who've tried to buy the club, have been put off by the fact that he does seem wedded to the idea of the Saudi consortium. And I think that's probably because he's you know, heard what we all heard in the summer about what their plans were for the club, and what also the you know, what also potential retail benefits that he might get from working with the Saudis as well. So yeah, it feels to me like, you know, this is the key period, isn't it? We did in a podcast earlier, we said the spring was going to be key. I think now people can kind of see what I meant by that. The arbitration is going to be not too far away. I don't think arbitration will happen in the next few months. I think it'll probably happen in, you know, before the summer, or you know, a point over the summer, and then it's where you go from there. There's been even some talk of PIF getting involved in Inter Milan, which is, you know, will have worried Mike Ashley, because, you know, I do wonder whether, you know, it's gone on long enough. And I remember talking to people in the summer about it, and they said, you know, one thing will be, can you, you know, they've walked away, can you maintain their interest for long enough? If it goes on for another year, it goes on for another 2 years, what are they, you know, the plans that they have in place, you know, are they going to just look at it and say, this is, you know, this doesn't make sense? But having said that, I think, you know, for me, they'll, you know, it's better for them now. They talked about the commercial uncertainty of you know, potentially taking over a time of a pandemic, and there being, you know, taking a while
for it all to happen, and they said, it no longer makes economic sense for us to invest. So now they're moving on a year. It's kind of March 2021. Richard Masters is talking about full stadiums from next season. There'll be 10,000 fans in the final game this season. You're going to know a little bit more about what you're taking on. There's a bit more certainty there. So I do think they'll stay at the table if they feel there's a way through. When they know what happens with arbitration, if it's found in Newcastle's favour, then the big questions start again. And, I think what was good about last week, and we've mentioned it before, I know there's a lot of cynics out there saying the takeover's dead. Why do you keep covering it? What are you doing? This, that, and the other. But I think last weekend showed, didn't it, that it's still there. It's still bubbling away. It's still the biggest issue for the club, or it would have been if relegation hadn't become such a massive issue. That now, I think, arguably the bigger issue, because if they go down, then it affects everything around the takeover. But it shows that this thing is still going on, and as much as people might kind of groan and roll their eyes at it, it's still there. And until we know the arbitration, until we know where we're going with that, then I don't think the club can move on as a whole from it. So we need a resolution. We've said that for a while. The gears of arbitration and the legal machinations were always going to take a while. It was always going to be in it for the long run. When the sort of second political phase, when they tried to pressure on to get the Premier League to change the move, it's always going to take a while. And sure enough, it has. And this whole season's going to play out, and we'll probably have some kind of biting our fingernails at the way the season's going to go. And then once we get there, we can start talking about the takeover properly in the summer again.
Well, there we have it. Mark, appreciate you popping onto the podcast. You guys watching and listening later on the podcast channel, thank you as always.